Hello everybody, it's Michelle Lupton here for Picket Fence Studios, and I'm going to show you how I made this card. And you can see on this card I have used a brand new stencil which is called Evergreen Stencil, and I've used it with a bunch of paper glazes. So you'll be able to see when I move this card around how those paper glazes shine in the sky. I was going for a look like an aurora in a sky, a night sky, behind these trees in silhouette. So it's very unusual for me to actually make a card on black cardstock, but here we are. So I used a bunch of different colours of paper glazes on this card, and I actually am making this second card differently to the way I made the first one. And the reason for that is that because I was using paper glazes and because I was using this stencil, which is more of a mask than a stencil really, I had to adhere the stencil to the cardstock using some temporary adhesive. And then I removed it, and then I wanted to white emboss the sentiment like I'm doing right now. But before I do white embossing on black cardstock, I also always use some powder tool. So some anti-static powder tool, so that the embossing powder only ends up where I've actually stamped in the embossing ink. The trouble is that the first time I made this card, there was still a bit of residual stickiness from the temporary adhesive that I'd used to hold the mask down. So it didn't work as well as I had hoped. So this time I decided to put the sentiment on first. So now I'm getting out my stencil, and I'm going to adhere this stencil down with some PIXIE spray, which is a repositionable adhesive. And this is quite important for two reasons. One, because I'm going to be adding the paper glazes using a foam application tool, which can actually grab onto the stencil and move it if you're not careful. It actually did that once to me while I was making this card. So the more it's stuck down, the better. So I'm just pushing this down with my Teflon bone folder to make sure it's well stuck down. But also that you'll notice that the stencil is only about the width of my card, which is 5.5 inches across. And so it'll be very difficult to adhere it like I would adhere most other stencils. So the repositionable adhesive is a really good idea. So the colours of paper glazes that I'm using, this one that I've just opened is golden rose. And it's a beautiful rich gold colour, and I'm applying it with a foam ink blending tool. Now you want to be very careful not to use your life-changing blender brushes with these paper glazes, because the paper glaze dries really hard and it'll just ruin your brushes if you don't get to it to clean it quickly enough. So yeah, we don't recommend you even try using them with your life-changing blender brushes. Most people have been using this paper glaze either to add to a stencil using a palette knife, or you can even water it down to make it into a watercolour paint. But I'm adding it like you would quite often use a stencil with an ink blending tool. But of course, just like on a brush, it'll dry hard. So using these ink blending tools is a good idea because the foam applicator part of them is replaceable, and those foam pieces are not very expensive. So it's not a big deal if they get ruined, but it does actually dry very hard onto these foam applicators. So you need to keep that in mind. You can see how I'm applying it is not by rubbing over the top of the stencil, it's by pouncing the blending tools on top of the stencil. Except for the next bit, above the trees, what I'm going for is the look of an aurora. Depending on where you live, it might be an aurora borealis, or it might be the aurora australis if you're in the southern hemisphere like I am. But I wanted those sort of stripes in the sky. And the main stripes I wanted to be were pink and green. Now, you might have noticed that I took the pink Paper Glaze, which is Peony pink, a beautiful rich pink colour. Most of it I took from the lid of the container, whereas this bit that I'm applying now I took from the main container. And what I found is that when I took the Paper Glaze from the lid, it was a little bit more dry, and that gave me a bit more of an opaque look on the card front, which is what I was going for with this particular card. So when I add the next bit, you'll actually see that I intentionally go for the lid rather than from the main container. But before I do, I actually changed my mind. I had picked up the leaf green Paper Glaze, but I changed my mind and decided to use the Succulent green instead, which is a much more aqua colour. So the colours that I used overall started with the Golden Rose, then I added some Snowdrop White, then I added Peony Pink. Now I'm on to the Succulent Green, and I'm also going to be using some Ocean Poppy as well, but not very much. So you can see I'm adding this in stripes, and because I took it from the lid of the container, I'm getting some really nice stripes, and that's exactly the look I was going for. I was not looking for a nice even blend. I was looking for some texture and movement in the sky, which is exactly what the aurora looks like. So it is very important. You can see I'm actually wiping up the Paper Glaze that I had on my craft mat here after each application. One, because I didn't want to mix up my Paper Glazes, but also you don't want them to dry too much, because it's a little bit more difficult to get them cleaned up when they're drier. With the blue, I didn't want too much of the blue in the sky. I'm just using it to fill in around the tops of the trees so that I actually had a good outline to those trees, so you could see the shape of the trees in silhouette quite nicely. But where I added the blue, especially on the left, I decided I'd covered up the pink a little bit too much, so I decided to go back in with the pink, and you can see I took it from a lid and I got much more opaque application there. By the way, the pink applicator I'd used for another card, and I'd dunked it in some glitter. I think it was some glitter gel. I'm not quite sure exactly what product it was because it was a while ago. So I actually got some leftover little bits of glitter in the pink, but I quite like that look, so I just left it. Now you can see I tried to remove the stencil there, but I realised that down near the bottom of the trees, I hadn't added enough of the gold and the white, the Snowdrop White, because I couldn't see the outlines of the trees very well down there. It was just a little bit wishy-washy, and I wanted to be able to see the outline of the trees. So I'm going in with this Golden Rose one more time. And it's probably because this Golden Rose is the one that I've actually used the most with this blending tool, and the foam on the blending tool is quite hard, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to get in around the edges of the stencil. So you just need to push a little bit harder, or maybe add a little bit more paper glaze, which is exactly what I'm doing here. I didn't want to add too much paper glaze in the first instance because I didn't want to end up with any sort of harsh blobs of paper glaze against the edge of the stencil. But I think I managed to get the look that I was aiming for at the end. Now, really importantly, when you have finished using paper glazes with stencils, it is very important, once you remove the stencil, to immediately go and put it into some water. That will make cleaning it off a whole lot easier. So right now I'm just putting the lid on my paper glaze, and now I'm off to another room to make sure my stencil is clean. All right, so all I'm doing now is I'm going to trim off the top and the bottom of this black panel, just so that I can have a little bit of a border of white at the top and the bottom of this panel on my card. I'm going to adhere it to my card base with just some tape runner adhesive, and then I'm pretty much done with this card. So the last thing I'm going to show you is I'm going to pull up the other card just so you can see that they're pretty much the same, but the Aurora looks ever so slightly different. And I'm going to show you this up nice and close so you can see the lovely sheen and shine that you get from these paper glazes. Thanks so much for watching today, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye.